Hello, friends, and welcome to episode number 67 of Nostalgia Talk. I'm James, but you guys already know that because you're here. You know, you've been here at least 67 times for all these shows. So thank you guys for coming. And that's just the intro. Joining me this time around is Sharon Lerner. Welcome.
Hi guys.
Now, for anybody who doesn't know, Sharon is a writer, researcher, and educator who joined Sesame Street before it even had a name, basically. If you've ever watched the documentary Street Gang, which here in Canada is available on Crave, and in the States is on HBO Max, she appears a lot in that, talking about her history with the show and how she joined, which we are going to talk about. But she was the show's first ever researcher, and during that time was also in the merchandising department and did a little bit of writing for the show and also for books, and also worked with Dr. Seuss, Stan and Jan Berenstain. That's really hard to say.
That was after I left Sesame Street, though. That was when I was with Random House.
Right. Mm-hmm. So in addition to that, also worked with Random House and also was a writer for the PBS series Between the Lions. So first of all, it's really, really good to have you here.
Thanks.
So let's start off. What did you aspire to want to become? Because you've gotten to do a little bit of everything.
When I graduated college, I thought, what can I do so I don't have to go to work? And then I went, graduate school. So I decided to go to graduate school and get a degree in educational psychology. Sounded interesting. So I applied to Columbia and got in. And so I got a master's in educational psychology from Columbia. And I became very friendly with one of my professors there, Sam Ball. So when I graduated, I went to Sam and I said, okay, now what do I do? Because I had no idea. And he said, well, Columbia University just got a 2-year government grant to do research on the Head Start program, which was a brand new program designed to teach disadvantaged kids. So it was a research program that was funded for the university for 2 years. So I applied for the job and I got the job and I worked at Columbia University for 2 years designing research for the Head Start program. At the end of 2 years, it was over. And I went back to my professor at Columbia and I said, okay, now what do I do? And he said, well, there's a group of people that are talking about developing a television show for this exact audience that you've just been designing research for. So I said, well, that sounds like a no-brainer for me. That sounds good. So I went to interview for what was the Children's Television Workshop.
Right.
It wasn't Sesame Street yet. That didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And I interviewed with the head of research, and he was asking me all these weird questions about what professional journals I regularly read and things like that. And I don't know, I just didn't think I was going to get this job. And then I went back to Sam Ball and I said, I don't know about this. And he said, you're talking to the wrong person. The person you need to talk to is Joan Cooney, who, as you know, is the one who started Sesame Street. She's the one who came up with the idea and raised the money. So I interviewed with Joan and she said, yeah, well, of course we want you. You've just been research. You spent 2 years doing research with our exact audience. You're perfect. So she actually hired me.
Nice.
And that's how I came to Sesame Street.
That's how you got to Sesame Street.
Sesame Street. And it had nothing to do with that's what I aspired to be, or I didn't have any thoughts about what I wanted to do. I just wanted to do something interesting and fun.
Well, that's definitely interesting for sure. And I was thinking about this right before I started, but I think this is going to be a very interesting show because not many people probably know that Sesame Street had a researcher.
Yeah, well, they should have, because I mean, it was called Children's Television Workshop. for a very specific reason. The idea was that we were going to develop television shows for a specific audience who was really being underserved. And we were going to research not only how we should do this, but whether or not we were successful. And as a matter of fact, the professor that was my professor at Columbia was hired by the Children's Television. He left Columbia University and he went to work for, he went to Princeton to work for, I forgot the name of the company. It was a company that developed testing. And he was hired by Sesame Street to develop what was called the summative research for Sesame Street. So not only were we going to do research to develop the show, but we were going to do research to evaluate the show. And then the idea was we were going to disseminate all of this information so that we could upgrade children's television in general for everyone. That sort of never really kind of happened.
Right.
There weren't too many people that copied. We wanted people to copy what we did. We wanted to learn from what we did and to create new things based on our research. That really didn't happen that much. It was kind of sad that it didn't happen. But yeah, so it was always intended to have two phases of research, which were the in-house research and what we affectionately call the outhouse research.
Okay.
And that was a very, very important part of the funding when we raised the money to develop the show. A very significant amount of that money was set aside for the research.
So can you talk about some of the challenges of working with the research department and making sure that the messages of what they were trying to get across in some of the segments could relate to the kids?
Well, the other idea was to hire educational television. Before that time, there were a lot of educators who went into television and they really were not very entertaining. They didn't really know very much about writing entertaining, amusing stuff for kids. So what Joan wanted to do was to marry educators and real television writers. So she pretty much raided the staff of Captain Kangaroo. And I mean, our executive producer came from Captain Kangaroo. Our line producer came from Captain Kangaroo. 3 of our writers came from Captain Kangaroo. I mean, we just basically, because they were the guys who were doing children's television and, but they really knew nothing about education.
Right.
And they knew nothing about how to teach kids. So one of my jobs specifically as curriculum coordinator was to, after I did research where I went out in the field and tested kids and watched how they watched television and learned a lot about that, my next job was to work with the writers and to basically teach them how to translate these list of goals that we had, list of educational goals, into entertaining segments. So you could be funny and you could be entertaining, but you had to make sure that you made the point that you were trying to make. So we developed something, and I think I talked about it in the documentary. We developed something called the Writer's Notebook, where we gave the writers tons of suggestions of ways they could do this. They could translate these educational goals, and then we give them some suggestions of ways they might do it without saying, do this, because the idea was to give the writers as much freedom as possible. We didn't want to say, you have to do it this way. You've got to do what we tell you to do. We just wanted to say, here's an example. Now you take that and make it your own. And if you can make it funnier and more entertaining, go for it.
Okay.
So, and that way, what the writer's notebook did was it took away the confrontation, because sometimes the educators and the writers didn't see eye to eye. So rather than having direct confrontations, we had this notebook where the educators could put all their stuff in this notebook, and the writers could put all their stuff in the notebook, and there was no direct confrontation, but everybody learned something.
Okay. Including even the writers, learning how to, because as you had said, a lot of them came.
Because they didn't know. I mean, so for example, I think Norman Stiles talked about it in the documentary, the difference between counting and enumeration. So counting is just saying the numbers in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Enumerating is actually counting something. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you now have 5 fingers. That's different than just saying the numbers in order, and it has to be taught in a different way. So things like that they just weren't aware of.
Come to think of it, I have noticed that a lot on Sesame Street, that when it came to segments that taught counting, of course they would say the numbers as they were counting, but they were counting objects, for example, in the case of I'm thinking of talking about Norman. Of course, I'm thinking about Early Count, which mostly was written by Norman. But I remember one bit with Cookie Monster. I will count the cookies, and you will eat them. And so that also kind of teaches a little bit of subtracting as well, because Cookie Monster eats them as the count is counting them. So that's interesting. That it's teaching enumeration, not counting, by having.
Let me just. Here's a very good example.
Okay.
Learning the alphabet, learning to say the alphabet, until you are old enough to actually use a dictionary and look words up in the dictionary, there's no purpose to learning the alphabet. Why do you need to know that B comes after A and C comes after B? There's no reason to know that. The only reason to know it is because for some reason it is valuable. It's valued in our society. So for example, if you're 3 years old and you say the alphabet, everybody goes, "Oh, Johnny, you're so smart. You know your alphabet." Well, yeah, but it doesn't serve any purpose. Saying the numbers, just saying the numbers, doesn't serve a purpose unless you're counting something, unless you're doing something with it.
Yeah.
So, but there was a reason. One of the problems was disadvantaged kids were coming into schools without knowing the alphabet, and they were labeled as stupid and treated differently. And so when they learned these things on Sesame Street and went into school and had some background, they were treated differently by teachers, and that made a big difference too.
Right.
So there you go.
Yeah. And it's very true, most kids would just learn to spell using letters, but it's not common that they would be spelling the alphabet unless you were Big Bird, Abkadefki, Juckelman, Hopquist.
That's an oldie, yeah.
Yep. So you said that you started with Joan Gance Cooney, who, for any of the listeners who don't know, Joan Gance Cooney has been often described as the mother of Sesame Street. She co-created, not exactly Sesame Street, she co-created the idea for what was to become Sesame Street alongside of another fellow named Lloyd Morissette, who just passed away at the beginning of the year. Did you get to know Lloyd very well?
Of course. I was there when I got to Sesame Street with 10 people. So I knew everybody.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
What was he like?
Oh, he's a lovely man. Oh, what a lovely, lovely, sweet man. I really was very fond of him and very smart. Joan was working for New York Public Television, And I think she met Lloyd at a dinner party, and they
Mhm.
started talking about Head Start and kids, and the idea that you could probably, the kids were learning from television. What they were learning was they were learning jingles for cereal. That's what
Mhm.
they were learning,
Right.
and couldn't we teach them the alphabet? It would be the same thing. And that was her idea. And then she and Lloyd managed to come up with the money. And the idea of taking writers and educators and putting them together, that was another one of Joan's ideas. And they managed to come up with a large amount of money. At that time, that was an enormous amount of money for children's television program, $8 million. It was huge, 1968.
Mm. I remember in the documentary, Lloyd was talking about the fact that they spent a lot of money to make the show, and then it translated into the money that it would be like adjusted for inflation, how much it would cost 50 years later. And I just looked at that and I'm like, holy crap, for a kid show, that would be a lot. Yeah.
This was a lot of money. And they realized that they needed to do that to make it really good.
Mm-hmm.
And the other underrated person that wasn't even mentioned in the documentary was a guy named Bob Hatch, who
Oh.
was the director of public relations. He
Mm-hmm.
was our PR guy. And he was so smart. He got us on the cover of Time magazine. He got us on the cover of TV Guide. He just got us out there, and every time we had a celebrity on, it was big news, and he really made our name. And he was fantastic. And nobody talks about him. There were things in the documentary that were upsetting to me because there were certain people that were kind of left out that I
Yeah,
felt
that's what Norman and I were talking about.
enormously important. Well, the biggest one, I think, is Jeff Moss.
Norman agreed.
Yeah, I mean, that was like crazy. I mean, Jeff was the head writer of Sesame Street when when it was created.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's.
Mm-hmm. And he, from what I understand, he co-created some of the stars like Cookie Monster,
Oh,
Oscar the
absolutely.
Grouch.
Yeah. Well, people have the misconception that Sesame Street was created by Jim Henson. Sesame
Yeah.
Street was not created by Jim Henson. Sesame Street was created primarily by John Stone and the writers.
Mm-hmm. My sister once did a project on puppets for school, and she used me for research on it. And she's like, "So Jim Henson, he created the Muppet Show, Sesame Street, Fraggle Rock, Dark Crystal." I'm like, I gotta correct you on one of those. It's true that
More than one, I will tell you, more than one of those, because my dear friend Michael Frith created Fraggle Rock and a bunch of other things.
right, yeah.
So, yeah.
Mm. You brought up Jim Henson. I actually was wondering if you got to know him at all and what he was like.
Of course, I knew everybody. I was there. I was like, when we eventually, after the show was on the air for a couple of years, we started doing, that's when Chris Surf came, and we started doing books and toys and things. Chris came primarily to do the products.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got along with Chris really well, and I sort of left the research department and started working with Chris. But a lot of the stuff we did had audio components. So we were recording with Jim and Frank and all the puppeteers. We take them into the studio and direct them in recording sessions. And so, I mean, I knew these guys really well. Also, Jim and Jim's people had to approve everything we did.
Okay.
So I was Muppets as much as I was at Sesame Street.
Okay.
A lot.
So I'm just assuming that you probably spent a lot of time on the set of Sesame Street.
Well, I did two things. One is
okay.
I had a monitor on my desk in my office that was hooked up to the set, so that I watched. This is before I joined the products group. I watched everything that was being shot on the set. And I had, like my red phone, I had the phone connection so that if they did something that was not correct, I could call them instantly and say, wait a minute, got to do that over. That was not right. you have to change that or say this or don't say that or whatever it was. So I watched everything that they shot and from my office, but I also spent a lot of time on the set, particularly when there was a celebrity I wanted to meet.
That was actually just about to be my next question. If you had any celebrity stories that you wanted to share.
You know, I mean, we had everybody on the show. And so, you know, when we had people that were particularly interesting to me, I'd rush down to the studio to meet them. So that was a lot of fun. It was great. You know.
It sounds like you were just totally starstruck for some of them.
Yeah, you know, well, I mean, one of the first big celebrities we had was James Earl Jones, who I then, when I went to Random House, I went on to work with him on several projects. So I got to know him pretty well afterwards, after Sesame Street. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was really,
that's great.
I have to say, we had, did you interview Chris Surf?
I have, yep.
Did he tell you how much fun we had?
Oh, trust me, I've heard many great behind the scenes stories from Chris Surf.
Imagine when we first started doing toys and every toy company wanted to work with us, they would send us stuff. And one of the things one company sent us was those clip-on roller skates that clipped onto your shoes.
Oh, yeah.
We used to put on roller skates in the morning and we'd have the Sesame Street Products Group roller derby. One of the things, I don't know if Chris told you the story about the lunch brigade.
Oh, I don't think I have heard this one.
Okay, so they sent a memo saying that we were not allowed to eat lunch at our desk because they were having a mouse problem.
Oh.
So you weren't allowed to eat lunch at your desk. So Chris and I had these kids' fire hats, like fireman hats.
Yep.
We made signs for them that said lunch brigade, and we took clipboards and we went around the office and we confiscated people's lunches. You have to confiscate your lunch and put you on the board, and we write your name down, and we have to take your lunch. Oh, it was hilarious. It was really
I'll bet, yeah.
We did a lot of silly things. It was amazing. I wish for everyone that you could find something to do in your life that you loved as much, that made you feel good, and that was as much fun as I had. It was great. It was just wonderful.
So what was it like to watch the Muppet performers do their stuff?
Particularly, I was totally in awe of Jim and Frank, because one of the things they used to do, they would rehearse without the puppets. So they would rehearse with their hands and they do the whole thing, but they were so brilliant that you actually would see the puppet, even though there was no puppet there. They were so brilliantly, both Jim and Frank, and I think in particular Frank, was such a brilliant puppeteer, and they were just magic to watch. They were just, I mean, I loved all the puppeteers. They were all fabulous, and I was friendly with all of them. But it was wonderful. It was wonderful to watch them. They were just so talented, and it was, and the stuff, the writing was fantastic. I mean, it was hilariously funny. I mean, and we had things like people didn't even know. I mean, like, you know, the number animations that we had.
Like right at the start of the show?
Yeah, we'd have counting animations with race cars with numbers on them. And then
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
From Jefferson Airplane. I mean, you know, we had people on the show, people didn't even know the stars that we had on the show. It was amazing. What else can I tell you? The puppeteers were fabulous, and the puppeteers are now, I mean, my closest friends now are puppeteers. I mean, they're all the puppeteers that are actually now doing Sesame Street are still my close friends, and I see them all the time.
Mm. I was talking to Pam Arciero last year. Yeah. And we were talking about watching Jim and Frank perform. And I brought up something that Norman and Emily Kingsley had told me, that when
Mm.
Jim and Frank were performing, like they communicated with each other as the puppets, like not as themselves, as the
In
puppets.
character all the time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's and I asked Pam, was there ever a time when you were laughing so hard watching them perform that you were like just choking on whatever you were eating or drinking? She's like, well, I couldn't laugh out loud. And I was just thinking you had a television monitor
Well, I could laugh
watching a bit.
in the office. Yes, absolutely. I
Yeah.
could really laugh out loud, which I did a lot,
Mm. But probably not enough to make you choke on whatever you were eating because you weren't allowed to have lunch at your office.
probably I did, but they were just wonderful. And the puppeteers, even now, all the puppeteers that are working on the show now are just wonderful. It was like there were two companies. There was management and the production of the show, and the people who actually worked on the show. And those, and even though I was ostensibly in the office, my friends were all the show people, and the writers and the puppeteers, and they still are. They're still my dear friends, and I adore them.
Mm-hmm.
And they're wonderful people. They're just wonderful people. You can't say anything bad about any of them.
Oh yeah,
They're
they really are. Yep, they're and I mean I've become very good friends with many of them. Some of who have come on the show, and they are very kind and wonderful people.
they are indeed. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So shortly after the show began, you were talking a little bit about joining the products group, and I remember hearing, I forget where I heard it, but I remember hearing that when Sesame Street started, the rule was that they didn't want to be focused on buying, so they decided that they weren't going to sell anything. And then you had mentioned that Chris Surf came in to and he had like ideas for the
Chris,
products.
Chris's father started Random House,
Yep.
that.
Hmm.
And Chris was, we decided that if we were going to sell anything, it was going to be books.
Hmm.
We were going to have a publishing program.
Hmm.
So Chris was hired to come to Sesame Street to run the publishing program. And then little by little, we started talking about doing other things, toys and other things. We had to become self-supporting. We had to make money to
Right.
keep the show on the air. And so what happened was that everything that was created by the products group had to be presented to the Educational Advisory Committee. And I was on the Educational Advisory Committee.
Okay.
And the other people on the committee would look at what Chris presented and say, you can't do that. You can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. You can't do that. And I would say, well, you can't do it that way. But if you did this, then we could figure out a way you can do it. So I was helping Chris figure out how he could actually do stuff as opposed to just saying no to everything he presented. Besides which, he and I had, we both had a tremendous love of Mel Brooks, and we used to communicate.
I'm a Mel Brooks fan.
We used to communicate in 2,000-year-old man, memorize the record. So we really bonded instantly when we met. So shortly after we started doing this Educational Advisory Committee, Chris said, why don't you just come work with me? And I said, well, that sounds like a lot of fun. But the head of the educational division said, if you do that, you're no longer part of the research department, and you can't make pronouncements about the educational validity of things. So they kind of ripped up my degree and said, you're not allowed to say anything anymore. So I said, well, okay, that's all right. I don't care. And so then Chris and I started working together, and then we started doing more and more toys and games, and then theme parks and everything else records and, all of that stuff. And we just expanded until we had this huge department.
And to all you listeners out there, if you actually look at the back of Sesame Street records, I've got a couple of Sesame Street LPs around here. Yeah, you'll actually see Chris and Sharon's name under executive director.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So we laughed a lot. We had a great time, and we did wonderful things. There was nothing that came out of our department that I wasn't proud of. Everything we did was really high quality, and
And you also wrote books for Sesame Street quite regularly as well.
I wrote books usually when we needed a book. When we needed a book for something, I'd say, okay, I'll just write it. It was easier to just write it myself.
Well, my particular favorite from when I was a kid is Big Bird's Copycat Day.
Oh, yeah.
Which was actually illustrated by another friend of mine, Joe Matthew.
Joe and I started with Joe when he was a baby, when he first came to work. Yes, he was like, oh God, he was so young.
I'll send this to him.
I adore him. He's wonderful.
He really is, yeah.
And his son is in radio.
That's right, yeah. Joe actually sent me an interview that he did with his son on, I think it was WGBH. It was pretty cool to watch. It was like Joe Matthew talks to the other Joe Matthew. That's how it was described.
He was don't tell anybody, but he was my favorite. I adored him. I loved him personally, but I also loved his illustrations. And I have something on, I'm in my Connecticut house at the moment, not my New York house. And in New York, I have on my fireplace a painting he made of Mona Anything Muppet. And it's an Anything Muppet Mona Lisa. That's a fabulous painting that he made for me.
That's funny. Did you do like script writing for Sesame Street at all? I know that you and Chris Surf co-wrote I Can't Get No Cooperation.
Yeah, but what I didn't write actual scripts, but I wrote segments.
Okay.
I did a couple of things. One of my first jobs was to take live action film that was not successful. So, for example, we'd take some live action film that was produced and test it with kids, and they didn't like it or they didn't know what to look at. And we couldn't afford to just throw it away. So I had to figure out how to fix it. And what I came up with was an idea of using children's voices as voiceovers for these films, talking about what they were watching. So I would take the film into a studio with a bunch of kids, and the kids would talk about the film as they were watching it. We would record that, and that became the soundtrack for the film. So when you at home were watching the film, what you would hear is a kid saying, oh, look, that there's a cow. I wonder what they're doing with the cow. Oh, look at that. They're milking the cow. That's where milk comes from. So it showed you what the film was about and what you were supposed to be looking at, as opposed to, oh, there's a fly in the corner of the screen, or there's something else that might attract the kid's attention. This focused the kid on what you wanted the kid to watch. So I produced a lot of those soundtracks for the live action films. I also did a couple of things with John Stone. We did a series of animations where kids would describe something and it would animate on the screen, and they had to guess what it was.
Okay.
So John and I did those together. And there were a bunch of things that mostly I was like solving problems, trying to figure out how to make use of footage that we had, or soundtracks that we had, or come up with new ideas, or come up with animation ideas. So I did a lot of that, but I never wrote just a regular script.
Okay. But that's interesting though, because as I was rewatching some old school Sesame Street stuff, which I tend to go back to like a lot of the older stuff, and I actually did see
So,
some, maybe older stuff is the wrong thing to say, but the name of this podcast is, I mean, the name of the podcast is
what is classic?
yeah, I mean, the name of the podcast is Nostalgia Talk. Maybe I should have picked a different name. But as I was going back on some of the classic
Mhm.
there, hopefully that's a better way to describe it.
Right.
But as I was looking back on it, like I saw some of those films, like for example, kids painting a letter B, and there was like a soundtrack from a kid, like that's a B, that's a big B, and that's a
That was
small B.
pretty much sort of from my idea of using kids' voices as soundtracks.
Because I was wondering to myself, how is that being done? Are the kids like watching it live, or is it pre-recorded and the
We
people
would
just have to
do it
imitate
as,
it? Or
yeah, we'd have a chalkboard and we'd draw things on the chalkboard. We would record it and then we animate to the voice track.
that's very interesting. I always wondered how that was done.
And
So
that was the times that I got to work very closely with John Stone, which I adored because he was just fabulous.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So were you involved much with the electric company as well?
Well, we did electric company products. So I actually, went into the studio with those people and recorded stuff. We didn't do, I do have an electric company book that I wrote.
Oh, nice.
I think the nitty gritty rhyming riddle book was mine. It was an electric company book I wrote. I think I wrote a couple of other ones too. I can't remember. I also just had nothing to do with Sesame Street, just so you know. Chris
Okay.
Cerf and I are both published Star Trek authors.
Oh, nice.
We wrote Star Trek books together.
Nice. Live long and prosper.
Right, yes.
That is the second consecutive show that I have done that, because I was my last guest, Michael Goff, and I started talking about Star Trek, and I did that instead of my traditional sign off as a joke. Moving on a little bit from Children's Television Workshop, what was it? You worked a lot with Dr. Seuss.
I left Sesame Street after I think it was like 16 or 18 years. It was a long
Okay.
time. And I literally went one day, I was at Sesame Street. The next day I went to Random House.
Okay.
And my title when I was hired at Random House was Vice President of I Don't Know, We'll Think of Something. My title. And because I had no idea what I was going to do there, they wanted me to come because a lot of children's book publishing at the time was based on licensed characters. And because I had a relationship with all of the toy companies because of Sesame Street, I knew every president of every toy company. And it was very helpful to them in getting the licenses for the characters for publishing.
Mm-hmm.
So, but when I got there, I realized they had a school division where they had what do you call it? They had recordings of the books with film strips that
Oh, nice.
were specifically made for the school market. So I went to my boss and I said, I think we can sell this to the trade. We can package recordings of books with the books. And I think there's a market for that because there was no such thing at the time. So he said, great. And I started listening to the recordings that the school division had done. And I said, I don't really like these. And I think I can do a better job. Could you give me permission to re-record these? And he said, yes. And I said, well, then I think we should use celebrities.
Mm-hmm.
So I went out and I hired all the celebrities. I hired, Dustin Hoffman and James Earl Jones and Ted Dancing and Madeline Kahn and Walter Matthau and, oh God, a zillion other really great celebrities. And I got them to record Dr. Seuss, mostly the Dr. Seuss books, but other things as well. And I got to direct them in the recording sessions. I got to fly to England and direct John Cleese.
Nice. I love John Cleese.
How fabulous was that? I mean, it was just wonderful. So that's what I did a lot of at Random House. And then we started video. So we started making video of Dr. Seuss books and Berenstain and Richard Scarry. I got to meet with Richard Scarry in Switzerland. I had to fly to Switzerland to meet with Richard Scarry because that's where he was living at the time. So that was pretty fabulous. So that was wonderful. And then we decided to do multimedia. So we formed co-ventures with a company in San Francisco called Broderbund. I don't know if you're probably too young to remember Broderbund. Carmen Sandiego, do you remember that?
I do, yes.
That was one of their biggies. But anyway, we did Dr. Seuss CD-ROMs with them. And we also worked with a company called Humongous and Knowledge Adventure. We formed co-ventures with a lot of these techie companies. I was spending a lot of time. Oh, before this, one of the first products I worked on at Sesame Street was with Atari. The first children's handheld control for video games for Atari.
Oh, nice.
Sesame Street handheld controller I got to work on. So I knew the founders of Atari through that. So that was, Random House experience was a wonderful experience. I was there for 14 years doing all this stuff. So I wound up being the publisher of the multimedia division, And then the other thing was they were sending me out to look at companies to buy. At that time, Cy Newhouse wanted to acquire companies, and the woman who was the head of new media for the whole company and I were going out to meet with people to see if we were good matches for Random House to buy. And one of the first people we met with was John Lasseter, because we recommended that Random House buy Pixar. And the other person, right? This was way before Disney. And then the other company that we recommended was Marvel Productions. So I got to know Stan Lee. But
nice.
I knew Stan another way. I knew Stan because we published Spider-Man Super Stories for Electric Company.
Right.
And that's how I got to know Stan.
Because of course Spider-Man was on the Electric Company. So.
Exactly. And Stan was a lovely guy. I really was fond of him. He's a real guy.
It's interesting that you mention the Dr. Seuss videos, video versions of the books. I do remember Dustin Hoffman reading Horton Hears a Who.
Yes.
Yeah, that was available at my elementary school library. I remember borrowing it because I grew up with Dr. Seuss, of course. Well, I mean, what kid didn't? It's classic stuff. But I do remember the Dr. Seuss CD-ROMs very well as well.
I worked a lot on those.
Yeah, I remember the green eggs and ham one.
Very friendly with the people from Broderbund that I worked with. Michelle Bushnell is one of my best friends, and she's the person from Broderbund I worked with on that project. So all the people I worked with on these various different things became my friends, and they're still my friends.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, what was it like to do writing for Between the Lions? I grew up watching that show. I absolutely love it. I still love watching it to this day.
It kind of sort of makes me sad that show was brilliant.
It really was, yeah.
Brilliant show. I love that show so much. It was such a wonderful, wonderful show. And why we couldn't keep it on the air was just sad to me. I mean, we should have been able to. It was, again, it was, puppeteers were wonderful. You're still my friends. And, I mean, Jen Barnhart, who played the
Cleo
lion, she does Sesame Street a lot. And there's a studio that's actually down not very far from my apartment, where they do a lot of shooting, green screen shooting for Sesame Street. Whenever she's shooting in that studio, she stays with me at my apartment.
Oh, that's really sweet.
When I say they're my friends, they're my really good friends.
I believe you. Yeah.
I love them all. I really do.
Mm-hmm.
It's been wonderful. So we did, I had Sesame Street for many, many years, and then we did an electric company and 3-2-1 Contact, and there were more shows. We did a number of shows, and then Random House was a wonderful experience, and getting to do all that, meet all those people, and then Between the Lions was spectacular, and then after that. Michael Frith and Kathy Mullen, who are married. Michael, when I first met Michael, I've been working with Michael for over 50 years without a break, because I first met him when he was working at Random House and I was at Sesame Street. And when we did books with Random House, we worked with Michael. And Michael and I, for example, wrote a book called Big Bird's Busy Book together.
Yep, I have a copy of it. It's a lot of fun.
Me and Michael wrote that book, and we actually did a book tour for that book, which was crazy. But
wow.
So, and then Michael left Random House and he went to Muppets, and he became creative director of Muppets. And every product that we did for Sesame Street had to be approved by Muppets, and specifically by Michael and his department. So everything I did, I spent a huge amount of time with Michael, working with Michael on all the Sesame Street product. As a matter of fact, for my last birthday, I decided to buy myself a birthday present, which was to buy myself the one product that Michael and I, our favorite product of everything we ever did on Sesame Street. And I for some reason, didn't happen to own it, which always upset me. And I found it on eBay, and it was stupidly overpriced. And I said, I don't care, I want it. And what it was is a Big Bird egg beater. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's fabulous.
I've worked with egg beaters before.
This is a Big Bird egg beater, where you take Big Bird's arm and his legs are the egg beater. And it's so dopey. It's such a silly concept that Michael and I always loved it. So I bought myself one from eBay recently. But I drink my coffee every single morning out of a little Gorham China Sesame Street cup that Michael designed. He designed the whole dishes set, and I have it and I use it every day.
That's funny.
So Michael was working for Muppets, and I left Sesame Street and went to Random House, and I did Muppet books and Muppet things and all the stuff I was working at Random House. I still had to work with Michael for Muppets and Sesame Street stuff when I was at Random House. And then Bertelsmann, Cy Newhouse sold Random House to Bertelsmann, and Muppets was being sold to Disney. And Michael and I both said, we're leaving. So he left Muppets and I left Random House at exactly the same time. And we literally just went across the street and went to Between the Lions. There was not 1 minute that I was unemployed. I just went from one thing right to the next. And then after Between the Lions, Michael and Kathy formed a nonprofit called No Strings. I don't know how much you know about No Strings.
I did a little bit of research about it, getting ready for this.
So we've done about 20 videos now. We do these puppet videos for at-risk children in developing countries, and we've done about 20, and we work with the same puppeteers and the same, as a matter of fact, the filmmaker who filmed all of our No Strings stuff was Luke Weissbuehler, who did the documentary, who filmed the documentary. So it's all the same, it's always in the same family. We're always working with the same people. And that's that, No Strings, we did that for like 15 years, I don't know. And then, out of the blue, Michael, Kathy, and I get hired to do a crazy project, which is to develop a puppet series to teach Mandarin Chinese to children in private schools in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
So we did 32 videos, which we produced in Brooklyn. I had to find Chinese actors who could dub, sing. They had to be born and brought up in Beijing because they wanted a Beijing accent.
Mm-hmm.
So I managed to find these people and get them together, and we produced 32 of these videos, which were enormously successful. And then Michael, Kathy, and I got to go to Paris to present this to the school, and it was pretty fabulous.
That's amazing.
So that was I was actually was it the last paying? Yeah, it's the last actual paying thing that I done, and it wasn't that long ago.
Hmm.
And now I'm working with a group of young puppeteers who are trying to put together a new project that they're trying to get off the ground, and we'll see if anything happens. I don't think I can talk about that yet.
Okay.
But if it happens, we'll see.
Mm-hmm. So let's wrap it up with a fan question.
Sure.
This one comes from Connor Gibson, and he wants to know, what are your thoughts on recent adaptations of Dr. Seuss's books, such as the TV show Wobulous World of Dr. Seuss, the Netflix series Green Eggs and Ham, and the films, live action and animated films based on Dr. Seuss books? I don't know if you've seen any of these.
Yeah, I've seen most of them.
Okay.
What can I say? I'm not a huge fan.
Okay.
I love Ted. I love Dr. Seuss. I was very true to exactly what he did. I didn't love people trying to be Dr. Seuss who weren't. And I didn't love Wobulous World. I know Michael had a lot to do with it, but I wasn't a big fan of it. I didn't love it.
Okay.
I'm old school. What can I say?
Nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Well, that's all I've got here. Is there anything else you want to say to wrap up?
No, I just want to tell all your viewers, as I said before, that I hope they find something to do with their life that gives them as much joy as my career has given me.
Well, to all you listeners, words to live by there. Sharon, thank you very much for joining me for Nostalgia Talk.
I'll be talking to you.
And also, side note, big thank you to our mutual friend Ozzy Alfonso for connecting us.
Oh, okay. I love us. I love these guys. Yeah.
So to all you listeners out there, I will see you next time. Peace.
Bye. Peace.